Good evening, everyone. I hope this is working. Is it? Yes, very good, excellent. Very good to see you all again. So we've got ourselves onto the Tarquins, and as promised, I need to shock you and drive you to depths of despair, lust, and depravity over the next hour. So we'll start off with a couple of images of Tarquin the Proud, one by Goltzius in the 16th century and one by Alma Tadema. And this Alma Tadema is a famous story when Tarquinius Superbus is asked what should be done about powerful people in his community, and he just takes his sword and slices the heads off the tall poppies. So, decapitation is where we begin. Now, in my previous lecture, we looked at the earliest kings of Rome, the first four kings. My argument centred on the problem of myth and history. It's evident that there are serious problems with believing that the early kings are historical figures. As we saw with Romulus, there are a number of different stories. They're not all consistent with each other. And this has led scholars to suggest that these kings are, as I said, mythical figures. But the problem of simply parking these kings in a loosely defined category of myth seems to me to be at least as significant as the problem of their historicity. What is the myth of? What work is the myth doing? Created by and for whom? In what circumstances? How is it reiterated? What does it mean to say that something is a myth in historical terms? How do we contextualize it? So in order to circumvent that problem, and here's a myth. This is Metis Fufetius being dismembered by Tullus Hostilius outside the walls of Alba Longa. Well, in order to circumvent this problem, I borrowed the term myth history to suggest that what we should be studying is the critical reflection on myth in historical times and with a historical impetus. Using the example of Ancus Marcius, I suggested that one possible context was the time of the Latin Wars in the 4th century BC, and that was a point at which problems of integration, absorption, loss of identity, mixed identity might be much to the fore. And that this offered a way of interpreting the expansionism of Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius as both implicated in divine fortune and also metaphorical for these tensions between conquest and absorption. At a more general level, I suggested that the idea of stranger and dying kings was one which the Romans may have used more or less consciously to express the complexities of kingship. However, rather than seeing these as deep structures of human existence, rather than heading down either a Dumasinian or a kind of Levi-Straussian line, I wanted instead to see them as part of what Salins called the what it was that happened when Romans tackled the political issues of the 4th century BC. Now, to an extent, this kind of argument is not dissimilar from what Peter Wiseman does when he tries to give a historical context to the myth of Remus. But I find his precision to be perhaps over-optimistic. So Wiseman reckons that you can actually pin almost a day and a date to the moment when the myth is first told. I think it's harder to get beyond more general statements that in the particular argument that I've been making, the 4th century is rather important. And I've just put this up because this rather beautiful fragment of pottery is one of the finds from Tina Pinella's excavations up the slope from the Arch of Constantine up to the Arch of Titus. You remember I showed you that overhead. This fragment, which is securely dated to the 4th century, is one of the few 4th century pieces of pottery we actually have from Rome. And it's just giving us an idea that they really knew, they were being opened up to the height of Hellenistic culture at that time. So I don't think we can get a lot closer than saying the 4th century is a context in which some of these things are happening. But it is true that, like Wiseman, I'm trying to introduce the concept of history into an account of the early kings. Now, having said that, you might think that the next stage when you get to the Tarquins is to do even more of that, because lots of people think that the Tarquins are Tarquinius Priscus the first, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, are more historical, that there is this step forward in the possibility of believing in what the sources are saying. But I want to do the opposite. And it's not just because I'm completely perverse, it's because I think that the reasoning that underlies that idea that somehow you go from non-historical mythical kings to historical kings is really flawed in two ways. I think it ignores the way the Romans are flattening out what is a very complex tradition for the Tarquins, as I'll give you some indication of in this lecture. It also, I think, makes us underestimate how strange the 6th century was. And by underestimating and making it too rational, it gives us problems that I'll hope to bring out a little bit more towards the end of this lecture, and it will recur in lecture 6. So let's have a look at the sorts of reasons that people give for saying that the Tarquins are and Servius Tullius are more historical than preceding kings. Well, the first argument is derived from the account itself. So you read Livy and, you know, Romulus, wolves, okay, that's a bit weird. Tullus Hostilius, errant lightning bolts. You know, there's something kind of strange. Whereas when you get to the Tarquins, it's a kind of straightforward political history. There are kind of bad Tarquins and reforming Servius Tullius and constitutional stuff. This all seems very plausible. There's more detail. There are more walk-on figures, which suggests that we might know more. There's a bit more context. This is Tarquinius Superbus kicking out Servius Tullius, who, because he's an old man, has got his pair of spectacles. He's about to wander rather miserably up the Via Sacra and get run over by Tullia. So you kind of think, well, actually, this is all very logical. We can believe this stuff. Now, I think that argument that somehow it looks plausible is completely worthless, because it assumes that the Romans weren't capable of making the story plausible. That doesn't make any sense at all. The Romans clearly were capable of flattening out strangeness and producing a sensible political story. And it's the same, by the way, that you'll sometimes see when people say that something in Livy sounds, well, a short sentence of Livy sounds like it comes from the Annals. And the Annals are supposed to be boring lists of events. And so when Livy just says, in such and such a year, 21 tribes were made. And commentators say, oh, well, that must have come from the Annals because it's a very short sentence. As if Livy wasn't able of writing a short sentence by himself. This doesn't work. We've got to move on. So archaeology. Now, we touched on this in the second lecture. There's no doubt that archaeology does seem to confirm a major push of building activity in the 6th century BC. Some of the buildings that are attributed to the Tarquins do indeed fit with the archaeological record. In other words, the Tarquins and Servius Tullius are 6th century BC, according to the traditional account, and there are temples, walls, drains, and so forth from securely dated to the 6th century BC. And we looked at this in one of our lectures. And superficially, this is very interesting. And even if the chronology is a bit shaky, and even if you've got a problem with the Tarquin Servius Tullius reign being a bit too long, you could chop it down by a half and you'd still be sort of okay. And it seems to imply that the Romans knew what they were talking about. Well, we have to be careful. The 5th century BC, after the kings, is a real mess of a period in all sorts of ways. And the Romans knew it. Livy starts book 6 of his history by saying, all that stuff I told you in books 1 to 5, I made it up. because all the records were destroyed in the Gallic sack. So everything before 390, frankly, is a bit iffy. Sorry about that. You should imagine the reader getting to the beginning of book 6. Hang on a minute. What did I just waste my time? Well, okay. So only another 118 books to go. So we've got somehow to assume either that there was some sort of historical record that dates back to the kings, and we've never been able really to find one, or else what the Romans do is they say there's stuff that is older than that really messy period in which things were really difficult. Now, if they just say the 5th century is really difficult, so it must be older than that, they've only got the kings to go. I mean, it's just logic rather than knowledge. I think that the 5th century was a period in which not much happened because we were constantly fighting. Therefore, big walls and big temples must have belonged to an earlier period. That's the period of the kings. Now, that isn't getting us very far. It's a logical approach rather than one based on any kind of sources. And indeed, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Capitolinus, here reconstructed with lots of colours on. This is obviously fanciful, but just to remind you that ancient temples were very colourful. And we know that there's a quadriga in terracotta at the front 4 horses with a chariot, because the sources tell us about that. From a later period, it survives for a long time. Romans want to have things both ways. Tarquinius Superbus is supposed to build it, but it isn't dedicated until the first year of the Republic. So it's a republican building, even if the work is done by a king. And the Romans are hedging their bets here in the way that they're presenting this material. So I come back to the point I made in lecture 2. Archaeology is not there to prove that history is right or wrong. It is exciting that there's an apparent match of the Temple of Jupiter, for instance. But we've now got, as I mentioned, lots of temples, and it's not so easy to match them all up with a historical notice. We've got more and different temples than the ones the sources record. And we haven't got the slightest idea, if we're honest, how they were produced, how they were managed, who actually dedicated them, if they are in the 6th century BC. So archaeology will get us a distance in terms of the context of society, but maybe not further. So the next thing you do is you say, well, look, there's the Greek parallel. Greeks had tyrants. And we've got this from historical sources who are much closer to the actual time. So Herodotus is writing in the middle of the 5th century about things that are happening at the end of the 6th century. That's a short gap. And there are people before him. So it's easier to see eyewitness accounts. So let's say a little bit about tyrants. A tyrannos is a sole ruler, often arriving at power from outside the normal elite, possibly in slightly unconstitutional or unusual ways. Tyrannos is an Eastern word in origin. It's not a Greek word, it's an Eastern word. So it brings with it associations with all the iconography of power and royalty. And the phenomenon of tyranny in Greece is really quite well known, and there are some very, very powerful literary figures, or powerful figures in the literary record. Cypselus, for instance, is Periander, son of Cypselus, and here is the chest in which Cypselus was allegedly hidden when he was a boy. It's the sort of same story as Romulus and Remus in a way. They're trying to kill him, so his parents hide him in a chest, and then so that he's not found. And Pausanias describes the chest, which presumably is some kind of invention later, and here somebody, French, has tried to reconstruct what it looked like. Pisistratus in Athens we'll talk about a little bit more. Often these tyrants are in first instance regarded as helpfully resolving problems in their communities, breaking down entrenched monopolies of power, for instance. Most of them these days are considered to be historical, but even so, they all often attracted stories of unusual upbringings and good fortune, like the Cypselus box here. Many endeavoured to pass power to subsequent generations, but few were really successful. The usual narrative was that later generations were more dissolute and eventually provoked a reaction. Now, there's an obvious parallel with the Roman narrative. It's very clear. Tarquinius Priscus comes from outside Rome. He's the first of the Tarquins. Tarquinia, as his name would suggest. He has an unusual ancestry. There's a story which we can talk about another time. I think it's a late connection, but there is a story which puts him into a Greek context as a descendant of an exile from Corinth. He's vigorous and active. But when he tries to pass on, or when power is moving through to Tarquinius Superbus, it doesn't go sweetly. Tarquinius Superbus comes to power through bloodshed, and his reign ends in a welter of horror. So here I have to move you to tears. The terrible story of the end of Tarquin's tyranny revolves around not Tarquin himself, but his son, Sextus Tarquinius. We got that idea that as time goes on, the family gets worse and worse and worse. Sextus Tarquinius and his friends are away on a campaign, and they're debating who has the most virtuous wife. And here they are debating in another wonderful engraving. One of the people at the dinner, called Collatinus, proposes that they go and visit his wife, Lucretia, who is indeed, when he says, "My wife is the most virtuous of all, I can prove it. Let's go and see what she's doing." And she is indeed sitting at home with her maidservants by candlelight weaving. Tarquinius is inflamed by desire, by this picture of virtue, and finds an opportunity to return. And here you see Botticelli's version of it, with Tarquinius there, and a horror scene over here. Because Tarquinius forces himself upon her, threatens to kill her, and says, "If you don't sleep with me, I will leave you dead in a compromising position with some slaughtered slaves, so that your name will be besmirched forever." Extraordinarily horrible blackmail situation. Lucretia is overcome. The following day, she goes to her father's house, confesses, and says that she cannot live with shame, nor should her husband have to, and kills herself. So she's got this horrible story, which is actually a gift for many artists subsequently, and I showed you the extraordinary Artemisia Gentileschi in a previous one, and she knew of what she painted. Her relative Brutus is one of the first to pick up the cry for revenge, and the Tarquinia family is expelled. Now, it's a brutal tale, but is it true? One of the things that has undoubtedly contaminated it is the later Brutus. So I've got a Brutus who is in the family. There's an immensely complicated familial structure, which I won't go into. But the later Brutus, who's the assassin of Julius Caesar, there's an obvious set of parallels running on. So one Brutus throws out a king, the other one assassinates a king. The early Brutus is related to the noble Lucretia. The later Brutus is married to Porcia. Porcia is of the Catonian family, so like every member of the Catos, she's bound to be a pretty tough soul. This is the story where Brutus is clearly keeping a secret from her. The secret is the conspiracy. She realises this. She realises that he's afraid that she will give the game away if she's tortured. So she secretly drives a dagger into her thigh and conceals the wound for a couple of days, and then reveals to him this kind of festering gash on her leg. And Brutus says, "Oh, my love, how wonderful, now I know I can trust you." I've got to say, this is a pretty dysfunctional relationship. I do not recommend this as the basis for marital harmony. Allegedly she commits suicide by swallowing burning coals. I mean, this is all pretty extreme stuff that's going on here, but somehow or another this story has infiltrated backwards, I think, onto the Lucretian Brutus story. That's a problem for us because Brutus is mid-1st century BC. So we can't really be sure whether this story is original to the king, the Tarquins, or whether it's very late. What it does do is fit into this Greek concept of tyrants or members of their family who use their power and position to gratify their sexual desire. Here is the famous Athenian story of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who conspire to kill a descendant of the Pisistratid tyranny who has stepped out of line. Well, these stories may not have happened exactly as they are described. We might assume that male violence against women is not going to be a surprise in the period. But what I really want to focus on is the fact that saying that the story of Lucretia looks like something you find in Greek tyrant stories doesn't really cut it, because we've got all this mid-1st century BC contamination. They might demonstrate a pattern of behaviour, but the possibility is that the account could have been constructed quite late on. The whole idea, which underpins quite a lot of, it's dressed up a bit, but really the basis of the argument that we can trust the account of the Tarquins because they look like Greek tyrants doesn't work. The other kind of argument is that the Greeks may have left an account themselves. Wouldn't that be lovely? By this time, the Greeks have established colonies in Italy. They were literate. They invented their own historiography. Could a Greek have been interested in the goings-on at Rome and passed down evidence across the long gap when there's no Roman historiography? Possibly. Unfortunately, the one who would probably give us the answer to this, Timaeus of Tauromenium, survives only in fragments. He's a 4th, 3rd century BC author. We know that he talks about rituals at Rome, but we don't have much history. And his sources are uncertain, so where was he getting the information from? He claims to have been in Rome, so it's autopsy. And the problem is that everybody claims autopsy, and so that can be a trope. And his reliability was often challenged in antiquity, particularly by the more substantially surviving Polybius. But the circularity would remain, even if Timaeus of Tauromenium wrote endlessly about how tyrannical Tarquinius Superbus was. All that would mean was that he had taken a method of thinking that he knew and applied it backwards. So we still have a problem. So it's another argument that we use, which is maybe the Etruscans had a source. Maybe they wrote about it. And it does appear to be precisely this tradition, which is why many scholars think that we can actually do something with the Tarquins. The Tomba François in Vulci was discovered in 1847. It dates to the 4th century BC. It contains 2 cycles of paintings, so the paintings are inside the tomb. This is a tomb. The deceased were put on these beds, and there's painted ceiling, decorations, and so on and so forth. Contains 2 cycles of paintings, which are a real mess now, and are better seen through reconstructions or watercolours done closer to the time of discovery by Rusby and then followed. So forgive the slightly garish paintings, but at least give you a chance of seeing something, unlike the sadly decayed real ones. One cycle of painting has Achilles sacrificing Trojan prisoners, presumably after the death of Patroclus. So there he is. There's a prisoner. That is Carun, the Etruscan version of Charon, the god of death, who's about to dispatch the character with his large hammer. So it looks as if you get caught out twice in Etruscan. You got, done by Achilles, and then Charon thumps you on the head as well. This figure here is sometimes believed to be the person to whom the tomb belonged. Velsaties, he's called, and he's something to do, presumably, with augury from birds. And then all the way round, there are these animals eating each other. You can just get a sense of it, this upper frieze here, the endless amounts of bloodshed. The other contains figures from early Roman history, and we know all this because their names, here you've got and I'm sorry about this, that Vulci wasn't actually in the original painting, just in case they didn't, but anyway, you can see through it. But as you can see here, there are, when the painting was done, there were captions above the top telling you who the people were. The picture represents the liberation of one person called Carle Distinguished, who I'm afraid is off here, Carle Distinguished, by Muxtana. Muxtana. Etruscan writes back to front. So, Muxtana. Okay. Then a man called Larth Ulthes is killing somebody called Laris Papathnus Veldsnak. Now, Veldsnak probably means that he comes from Volsinii. Over here, a man called Pesna Aremsnas Sviamak, Sviamak possibly means a small town of Savannah, is being killed by somebody who only has a single name, Raske, which is quite interesting. And then Venthical Pissax, here, is being done for by Aule Vipienas. Aule Vipienas. So Carle Vipienas is being released over here. Aule Vipienas is killing somebody over here. And a final scene on an adjacent wall shows somebody called Marque Camitlanas, who menaces someone called Cnaive Tarquinies Rumac. Rumac might mean Rome. Cnaive is Gnaeus, and Tarquinies must be Tarquinius. This is great. We've got it. We've nailed it. Finally, we've got our source. Why have I been holding this back for so long? It gets better. Remember, it gets much better. Remember this figure here, McStana. And also, bear in mind that McStana's the only one wearing any clothes. This is not irrelevant. In a speech in the middle of the 1st century AD, given by the Emperor Claudius, which survives in an inscription in Lyon, and also in a paraphrase in the historian Tacitus, the Emperor Claudius says that Etruscan sources said that McStana was a companion of Caelius Vibena. That's the man who's being freed by McStana over here. That after various misfortunes, McStana was forced out of Etruria with the remnants of Caelius's army and took over the Caelian hill at Rome, changed his name to Servius Tullius, and became king. It's brilliant. And Claudius, this is pretty exciting because Claudius knew what he was talking about. He wrote a 13-book sadly lost history of the Etruscans. We know he knew the language and was generally considered rather clever, if a bit hopeless with women. So, and I should have had a bit of I Claudius here. I'm sorry, this is the moment I could have had my Derek Jacobi slide and I've forgotten it anyway. Just imagine Derek Jacobi stuttering up there. But this is a serious piece of information, right? This is not coming from some idiot. Claudius really knows this stuff. This account where Servius Tullius, McStana, is a friend of Caelius Vibena and a sort of right-hand man, a general, stands in pretty good contrast to the Roman version, which Claudius also cites, which is that Servius was born to a slave woman called Acrisia. And at least in one of the accounts, Acrisia sees a disembodied phallus dancing in a hearth in the palace and immediately conceived a child who, when born, was clearly special because flames danced around his head without hurting him. I think we would all agree that the Etruscan version seems to have more going for it in the plausibility stakes. Soldier, disembodied phallus. You choose. So, the Tomba François and this fantastic inscription, isn't it a beautiful piece of epigraphy? Tomba François and Leon Tablet are in agreement. McStana and the Vibenas are both there. But, Gnaeus Tarquinius. We don't actually know of a Gnaeus Tarquinius. The two Tarquins that we know are Lucii, Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus. Okay. Well, maybe there are lots of Tarquini. That's not surprising. As a matter of fact, their family tree is enormous and covers all sorts of people. But this is also a weird thing. This person who's menacing this rather pathetic Roman is called Marque Camitlanus. Marque Camitlanus looks awfully like Marcus Camillus. And that would be fine, except Camillus is a figure of the 4th century BC. Now again, you can say, well, it's an ancestor, But Camillus is a figure who sort of floats a little bit in the tradition. So it's possible that as we start looking at this, the Etruscan version isn't quite the same as what the Romans are saying, leaving aside disembodied phalluses and flames. The fact that there are these two different stories is important. And it's possible that the Etruscans are actually preserving their own version of Roman history, and one which is in some sense highly trumpeting the Etruscan contribution to Roman history. It's an Etruscan king, Tarquinius, followed by an Etruscan general who are taking over Rome and doing horrible things to a strange figure like Tarquinius from Rome. Have we got something here that there's a traitor Etruscans who've gone to Rome and the good Etruscans are taking over? Who knows? We're not entitled, however, on the basis of the Tomba François, to assume that the Roman account followed the Etruscan version. And this really takes us to say a lot more about Servius Tullius, who's the in-between king. The in-between king. I've already shown you that sources provide two radically different accounts of Servius Tullius. One has him born in the palace, one has him a friend of an Etruscan condottiere. And he has two names, Servius Tullius and Mextana. His protectress in the Roman story is a woman called Tanakil. That's Becca Fuma's wonderful painting. Just bear this picture in mind because it'll come back in a moment. Tanakil is Tarquinius Priscus's wife. In order to ensure the succession of Servius Tullius, when Tarquinius has been killed on the orders of the sons of Ancus Marcius, we're told, she conceals the fact and pronounces Servius a regent, appearing at the window of the palace. He appears at the window of the palace and says, everything's okay, we've got it all sorted, Servius is going to look after things for a little while, and then gradually Servius sort of moves his way into power. And he's not elected by the people, the only king who isn't. Now, the other account has him as an adventurer, as we've seen, coming in as a result of military, not political process. How do we get around this? How do we get around two completely incompatible accounts? One way is to suppose that there may be two figures here, and that they've been conflated. As Tim Cornell says, there can be any number of Servii and any number of Mextanas. In other words, Claudius was wrong to offer these as alternative genealogies for the same person. They were two different people. What we see happening is the Roman bunging together of things to create a very straightforward linear account. There's one version of Roman history which has got 8,000 people who are kings in the 8th, 7th and 6th century, and half of them last for a day. It's a bit like Italian politics now, really. And the other version has long-lasting, stable kingships. That's a lot easier to write. And this is one of the ways in which we dissolve the idea of the canonical 7 kings and can suggest that there's a messiah sequence which is not retrievable but probable. And another is to assume that the constant feature is the name Mextana. But Mextana is interesting because Latinized, it would come to something like Magister. And there's an office called the Magister Equitum, the chief of the cavalry. The Magister Equitum is the right-hand man of the dictator in the Republican periods. When you've got a dictator, the dictator always has a Magister Equitum. So Mextana, in other words, isn't a name, it's an office. And we see quite often the way that office titles become names. So there could have been lots of Mextanas. Then the simple challenge is to decide whether Etruscan sources have any motivation or reason to invent the story of the Verbennas as a rival to the story of the Tarquinian dynasty. So it becomes possible that the reason why we've got this story in a tomb in Vulci is because Etruscan towns were competing with each other to be the originators of dynasties elsewhere. So there is a kind of grand sense of saying, you know, I belong to this city which has been founding colonies all over the place. None of that needn't be true. They may be competing and their inventions may be competitive. And obviously, this may feed in to problems over good King Servius in one tradition, killed by bad King Tarquinius in another. And there he goes again, this wonderful incunabulum. Blood everywhere. I told you there'd be blood. I told you there'd be blood, right? So if anybody's squeamish, you were warned. And Servius Tullius represents, I think, a particularly sharp example of the problem of looking too hard for confirmation of the traditional account. We seemed for a moment, very excited up here, I was bouncing around, look, we've got this tomb, and we've got Tarquinius, and we've got Servius. And we seem to be very close to a perfect match between a quasi-documentary Etruscan source and a Roman historical account, combining to prove the existence of one of the Roman kings. But on inspection, the two accounts end up diverging so significantly that it's far more likely that the Tomba François is an anti-Roman story. The mythical birth of Servius is fiction, and the Roman Servius Tullius has to be understood in his own terms. So what kind of king was Servius? Now, we've mentioned several times the way that the kings operated as mechanisms of distribution of developments of Rome. So one gets religion, another gets warfare. Servius Tullius was the reformer. He was the one who modernised Romulus's state as it grew in size and strength. He's said to have reformed the army, the constitution, introduced coinage, and the list goes on. Can any of this be true? In detail, it looks very much as if the answer is no. Coinage is an impossibility for the 6th century at Rome. There simply is no evidence whatsoever for anything that looks really like coinage. There are some metallic exchange items, but it's not what the sources are telling us. The details of the army reform, and you see it here, it's very, very detailed. Dionysius Halicarnassus in particular goes into great detail about how the Roman army is divided into these classes, property classes, and you've got equestrians who are in the cavalry, and then the first class has got brown shields, cuirass, green spears, swords. Class 2 have got everything except cuirass. Class 3 haven't got greaves either. Class 4 only spear and shield. Class 5 you're basically screwed. So and there's kind of this, well, this almost certainly, most scholars would believe, represents a much later reform, probably again in the 4th century BC. Again, we come back to the 4th century. Various versions are given of the way that Servius redefined the constituent components of the city of Rome, and it is indeed quite probable, quite logical to think that as Rome grew, and we've seen that in the archaeology, that it was necessary to rethink how the city was organised. The critical shift appears to be to recognise urban tribes, 4 urban tribes in the city, and then rural tribes outside, a sort of inner and outer circle. And we hear of similar sorts of reforms, for instance, in Corinth. But there are troubling inconsistencies in the sense that at some stage, everyone just worked out that anything that they thought logically must have happened in the 6th century, because 6th century Rome was clearly a bit posher and more sophisticated than Romulian Rome, everything that needed to happen was to have been done by Servius. Because after all, if you're presenting a picture of the Roman constitution as a good thing, you don't want to give constitutional reform to a murderous progenitor of rapists, right? You're going to go for somebody nice like Servius Tullius, who has spectacles and is a good guy. Well, so where does that actually get us to? What kind of king did the Romans actually think Servius was? What sort of legitimacy did he have? He wasn't elected by the people, he was appointed by the Senate, we're told. But he was popular, successful. Now, I think, oddly enough, and this is where I come back to the strangeness, that the problem of actually trying to say, look, if there is any kernel of truth is a very good phrase we historians use, search for the kernel of truth. The kernel of truth is that Servius was perhaps like a lawgiver who kind of made a few things work, and he has a sort of significant position. I've suggested that model. It also means that we take away some of the strangeness. So I'm going to give you a very long quote, which we'll go through quite quickly, from Plutarch on the fortune of the Romans. And this is how a 2nd century AD Greek, who had gathered up everything there was to know about Servius, Then they'd put all the stories together, and you see this kind of like a snowball avalanche, and getting more and more and more. This is where we end up with Servius Tullius, the man who of all kings most increased the power of his people, well-regulated government, imposed order on the holding of elections and military procedures, first censor, overseer of the lives and quorum of the citizens, highest repute, attached himself of his own initiative to fortune, bound his sovereignty fast to her. The result, it was even thought that fortune consorted with him, descending into his chamber through a certain window, which they now call the Port of Fenestella. Ooh, how exciting. Accordingly, he built on the Capitoline a temple of fortune, which is now called the Temple of Fortuna, and another temple of fortune, which is called Obsequens, which Plutarch can't translate. But I'm not going to bother with the Latin nomenclature because it's too hard. I am a Greek after all. And I'm just going to go with the Greek stuff. Well, there's a private fortune on the Palatine. There's a founder's fortune. Founder is a bird trapper. You know, somebody catches birds. That's what that is. And that might be thought a ridiculous name, but no, actually, if you think about it metaphorically, she attracted faraway objects and held them fast when they came into contact with her. It's quite clever, this guy Plutarch. Beside the mossy spring, as it's called, there's a temple of virgin fortune, there's a regardful fortune, there's an altar of fortune of good hope. Oh, hang on. Altar of fortune of good hope. There's beside the altar of Venus, the basket, a shrine of the men's fortune. There are countless other honours and appellations of fortune, the greater part of which Servius instituted. This man is knocking out a temple a day. He's so lucky. For he knew that, and here's a proverb, fortune is of great moment, and she is everything in human affairs. And particularly since he himself, through good fortune, had been promoted from the family of a captive enemy to the kingship. For when the town of Corniculum was taken by the Romans, a captive maiden, Acrisia, whose fortune could not obscure either her beauty or her character, was given to be a slave to Tanaquil, the wife of King Tarquin. Notice she's not just a slave now. She's actually a princess who's been enslaved. So that's okay. So that's better. It's not just some slave who kind of, was knocking around the palace. She's properly royal. Certain dependent, one of these whom the Romans called clientes. Nice little bit of social history going on there. Plutarch knows how clientela works. Had her to wife. From these parents, Servius was born. Or Acrisia was a maiden who took the first fruits and libations on all occasions from the royal table and brought them to the hearth. And it's a bit tricky because she's not royal here. But we get around it because casting the offerings on the fire, suddenly as flames died down, the member of a man rose up on the hearth. It is the lerb, phallus, right. This girl, greatly frightened, told this to Tanaquil only. Well, she would be, wouldn't she, really? Now, Tanaquil was an intelligent and understanding woman. She's seen this before. It happens all the time. She decked the maiden in garments such as become a bride, shut her up in the room with the apparition. Great. Can you imagine? Poor old Acrisia. Hang on a minute. I just wanted some help here. Student counselling service would not be allowed to get away with this, for she, presumably Tanaquil, judged it to be a divine nature. Love was manifested by the Lar of the house, others it was by Vulcan. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Well, it might to Acrisia, but who cares? Vulcan's interesting, by the way. Vulcanal is where the comitium is, the assembly point. That's not random that it's Vulcan. It's actually something to do with taking back to where the Romans assembled and politics. Anyway, at any rate, who cares? Resulted in the birth of Servius. Well, there we go. Child shone with radiance, gleam of lightning. But Antias and his schools, that's one of the Roman historians. Plutarch had read a lot. He's reading Valerius Antias, and Valerius Antias says that's silly. No, that can't possibly be true. It's when Servius' wife was dying, and in the presence of his mother, he fell asleep from dejection and grief, and as he slept, his face was seen by the women to be surrounded by the gleam of fire. Why Valerius Antias actually comes up with is really unclear, and we couldn't get very far with it in the fragments of the Roman historians. But I think, I'm going to suggest, there's something really quite interesting about the consequences of grief and being left alone, and departure is separated out from others by grief. It's a sort of also, it's not regicide, it's reginacide, if you like. It's the queen who dies, not the king. It's intriguing. And it's interesting Antias has this. Anyway, off we go, he becomes king. And of all kings, he is thought to be naturally the least suited to monarchy, least desirous of it. He was minded to resign the kingship. He said, I've had enough of this. I've sorted things out. You can imagine the story going, I've sorted a few things out, like a Greek nomothete who comes in for a little bit of time, fixes a few things, and then wants to give up, like Solon. Solon, the lawmaker in Athens, said, I fixed your laws, I'm going home now. I've had it. And Athens said, no, you can't do that. Come back. Tanaquil it is, Tanaquil, who on her deathbed, death again, something about dying women in Servius' story, made him swear that he would remain in power whatever set before him the ancestral Roman form of government. Thus to fortune wholly belongs the kingship of Servius, which he received contrary to his expectations and retained against his will. Wow. This is so rich, but it's also, there's a hell of a lot of really odd things that are going on underneath this. Now, we have two choices, and really this is something we'll talk about more next time, but one choice is to say that weirdness is all the product of late elaboration. Another is to say that the weirdness is actually, if anything, ironed out by the later sources, and it's hard to tell between the two. A little bit of me thinks that the weirdness has been ironed out, and all these associations are actually the key, and I'm going to show you why. Before we do that, I want to just mention again how the models for this kind of thing lie in the Greek world. And the most obvious connection is with this story of Pisistratus, the Athenian tyrant, roughly the same time as sources of Servius Tullius, about the same time, middle of the 6th century BC. So here's the story. Pisistratus has several goes at trying to be tyrant of Athens, and he was rebuffed. The Athenians don't fancy it very much. So he goes off into the Athenian countryside and he finds a woman. She's called Phae, and she's very tall. She's nearly 6 foot. It's pretty unusual. The bones wouldn't have very many people. So this very tall woman. He dressed her in white and he rode next to her on a chariot into Athens. She was taken to resemble Athena. There she is, Athena. Who accompanied Hercules, to heaven when the hero becomes a god, the only person to move from non-divine status to divine status. This is a big deal. It's the archetypal story, and everyone's interested in Heracles. When the Athenians see this, they accept Pisistratus as a tyrant. Oh, you found a very tall woman. Good enough for us. And Herodotus says, this just proves how really stupid the Athenians could be. He's from Halicarnassus. Athena and Heracles. Well, you remember, lecture 2, you'll remember this, popped out of a temple underneath San Almabono in the Forum Boarium. In the mid-Republican period, that temple is a temple of fortune. Fortuna. It's not the only one of these in central Italy, but it's the one we've got here. So we've got a time when power and fortune are being intricately associated. We've got the archetypal story of the ascent of a hero to greatness, featured on a prominent temple. Remember that temple, the first temple in Rome, on the liminal spot, on the Tiber, as people come into the city. Now, we have to find a better way to explain this than just to say that historical Servius Tullius was imitating Pisistratus' cunning ruse. What I'm not saying is that Servius Tullius was sitting at a breakfast table and the daily newspaper came in, flash headline, fake news, Pisistratus finds tall woman, Athenians accept him as tyrant, large crowds assemble, or small crowds assemble, whatever. And I'll do the same thing. Servius thinks I'll do the same thing. No. The sort of explanation which works here is that there are figures in central Italy and Greece, and possibly broader in the Mediterranean, who are putting themselves into the way, into the shadow, if you like, of iconographies of power and greatness. They're receiving the benefit of being associated with these iconographies. And I assume that whatever Pisistratus was doing was self-consciously associative too, and that Herodotus is being a little unfair. So we have now got this idea of the king as the extra-constitutional person emerging to solve a problem. And indeed, many people do think that Servius Tullius and Tarquin Superbus, because of various aspects of the accounts, do perhaps stand a little bit outside the constitutional element. And this exceptionalism can be shown both as a fact and a worry at this time in central Italy through another piece of evidence. And this temple frieze, we're going to see a better of an image or a larger image of it in a moment, comes from the town of Pergi. Pergi is the port site of Cerveteri. So another port site, Cerveteri, Caere, Etruscan site. Down at the port, someone called Thefaria Vellianus, we know, dedicated a temple alongside some Phoenicians from Carthage. We know he did this because of a unique bilingual text. 3 gold tablets, 2 in Etruscan and 1 in Phoenician, which were rolled up like a cigar and buried in a moment of crisis in the temple area. And they tell the story in Etruscan and in Phoenician of how Thefaria Vellianus dedicates, alongside the Phoenicians, this temple. The deity is Uni. Uni is an Etruscan, often equated to Astarte in Phoenician. The office in Etruscan is Zilath, and it seems to be translated in Phoenician as milk, M-L-K. Milk is a Phoenician term which can mean 2 things. It's either a magistrate, you do it one way, or it becomes Melkart. And Melkart is the Phoenician equivalent of Hercules. All right, so yes, we've got Astarte, Uni, Melkart, Hercules. Astarte is regularly associated in ancient sources and in terms of her activities with Fortuna. And in Eastern myth, Astarte not infrequently appears at a window, like Tanaquil. Now, Tanaquil promotes and protects Servius. Tanaquil's robes are found, according to the sources, in the Temple of Fortune at the Forum Boarium. Remember the dyeing stuff. She's not an ordinary woman, Tanaquil. That dyeing stuff, there's something else going on here. Milk Heracles should be immediately putting you in mind of this statue group at the Forum Boarium, of Hercules and Minerva. And Thefaria Vellianus holding on to his office paraconstitutionally is precisely the model that we've been playing around with for what these kings might be like. So what actually happened to Thefaria Vellianus? How did it work out for him? We don't know, but what we do know is this, that in that area at Pergi, a generation later, this extraordinary, one of the finest pieces of Etruscan terracotta architectural decoration was put on one of the temples. The myth that's represented here is of Tydeus and Melanippus, who were on opposite sides in a fratricidal struggle of the 7 against Thebes. Tydeus defeats Melanippus, but then is overcome by his anger and bloodlust and starts to eat the brain of Melanippus as he is dying. The gods are horrified. Look at Athena. She's turning her face away. She's taking her gorgoneion and she's actually using it to hide her eyes. One of the gods wants to intervene, but Zeus stops so that Tydeus can fully meet his, or rather forfeit his destiny. And what was his destiny supposed to be? He should have been made immortal by Athena, just like Heracles. So Tydeus is Heracles gone wrong. He's the type of the hero who doesn't know when to stop. And this frieze was destroyed just a few years after it was made to be replaced by another, now very fragmentary frieze of Heracles and Athena again. So there's a backwards and forwards Heracles, good Heracles, bad Tydeus. And is this reflecting maybe on a very difficult conversation about power. Thesauri Velianus is holding on to power, talking to Phoenicians. There are problems over whether the Etruscans should be close to the Greeks or whether they should be close to the Phoenicians. Where are your alliances with Carthage or the Greek world or with Rome, or where should it go? Is he a good mulk Heracles, or is he a bad Tydeus? These are warnings against violence. They're discourses about violence, about the disaster of civil strife. That's what the 7 Against Thebes is, isn't it? Fratricide, the absolute basic negation of community. Good and bad rulers and consequences are at stake. This isn't history as such, it's myth history. The conscious reflection on myth and then its operation on what happened. Now, I've stood in front of this frieze more times than I shall be able to count, and I still find it incredibly moving, because it's the point, I think, it's the moment when the denseness of associations actually give us a glimpse into what I think is really going on about kingship, about its consequences and about its myth history. So often when we've been talking, we've had a little bit of evidence, but when you start to add up here, Uni, Astarte, Fortune, Tanaquil, Heracles, Melkart, Forumboir, Impergi, port sites, liminality, etc. Suddenly you've got something which is actually really beginning to feel like we can trust it. And I want very briefly, very briefly, just to say that in this we should not, question, well, okay, fine, somebody has produced one of the great works of art from antiquity. And this is a brilliant piece. You've got to look at the horizontality, verticality. You've got this horizontal axis here, and then the direct centrality focusing you down on the crucial act of horror. It's a brilliant piece. We shouldn't forget the importance of the artist, the artisan and artist in this. Robin Osborne's recently written a terrific book called The Transformation of Athens. And what he does in that book is to argue that when we see changes in representation, so from black figure to red figure, and frontality to side-on views, which is often what happens from the late 6th, early 5th into the mid-5th century BC, it's not just form. It's not just, oh, let's try something else because I'm bored with black figure. I've done that, boring. It's that we're seeing a change in the way the world is perceived. A change in the way that the world is perceived. And it's artists who are bringing this to us because they are brilliant transmitters of those changes in perception. What determines a representation of fighting or athletics or sexual relations is not a change necessarily in those particular practices. People don't suddenly fight or run or have sex or make love in a different way. The way that the world is viewed, which encompasses all those activities, is changed. Now, there's going to be a lot of arguments, I think, over Osborne's account, but let's just play with it for a little bit. What we see happening in our period is, to begin with, this fantastic bestiary. The orientalizing bestiary has been called by Christina Biella and others, of all these wonderful animals and beasts and monsters that are being absorbed into the central Italian world from Corinth. And at a certain point in time, we move from an orientalizing bestiary into this kind of decoration, such as we find at Murlo, but at the Regia, at Rome, at Satricum, etc., etc. Images of individuals in performances of commensality. So from representations of monsters or warfare to images of people eating together, banqueting together, and each of them being slightly different from the other. These are not, very interesting, you look at these friezes, they're not all identical. There's individuality going on, even in quite formulaic scenes. This explicitly draws the viewer's eye towards reflections and reproductions of elite behaviour. The human has arrived. The interchange of gaze and variability contributes additional information, potential meaning. These are complex visual images representing and symbolising exchange and communication and social inequality, because there are some people who are sitting down, right, and there are some people who are serving them. So this world, which before was, you know, lions and sphinxes and stuff like that, has become a world in which society is being presented. Which is not to say that this was the first time anybody sat down, right? It wasn't that they all kind of wandered around saying, oh God, the world's full of sphinxes, so that we can't invent the chair yet. What's changed is the way the world is perceived. What is important? And the artists are what are pushing that through. And in the light of our what we're saying here at Piergi, the artists or workshop have chosen a specific way of dealing with the temple and dealing with this myth, which tells us something about the world in which they found themselves. This horizontal axis of communication and emotion, which is going on here. The vertical axis is of unmitigated atrocity. The monster has been brought back into the world, as if the Minotaur has interrupted a banquet. I think that we can keep enriching this in various ways, and as we enrich, we need some theoretical underpinning, and I'm coming to a close now, you'll be delighted to discover. We bring in pottery that is being used in central Italy, representations of Dionysus in exported wine containers from Etruria, the marvellous terracottas that we have just growing and growing, the complexity, the ridgepole statues of Veii, for instance, Apollo and Hercules again. You know, we pile all of this stuff in. The question is going to be, what's the theoretical underpinning that allows us to pull this together and write something out of it? Now, I want to suggest that the figure whom we should be looking at right now is Cornelius Castoriadis, a brilliant Marxist, economist, Greek, French, who contributed to us a wonderful idea of the social imaginary, or the imaginary institution of society. And what Castoriadis was saying in very complicated ways, but very boiled down, is that all the ideas we have contribute to a social imaginary, and that the critical thing about societies is that from that mix of things, you need to be able to pick and choose from the magma of ideas he describes. You need to pick and choose things, and you should always be able to change what the social imaginary is, because otherwise a society wouldn't be able to revolutionize itself. And what he says really beautifully is that it's fundamental to humanity to be able to imagine itself as something else. Fundamental to humanity to be able to imagine yourself in a different situation. And that's the root of change. The capacity, using all of these resources to imagine the world as different. It allows the opportunity for change. Now, the social imaginary in 6th century central Italy, we're only just beginning to get to grips with. But I would suggest to you that critically importantly, if we look at the social imaginary, we shouldn't be looking, we start not to see the kings, as it were, as running this, but rather the kings, whatever they were, and the stories around them, Astarte, Tanaquil at the window, Hercules and Minerva. And these ideas are part of the social imaginary that the kings and their communities are drawing on. And whatever those kings and communities are actually like, we can at least say that they're drawing on this shared social imaginary to construct stories of power. And I think that this then helps us enormously to try to get to the bottom of what's going on. 6th century BC culture is going to be competitive, individualistic, highly expressive, The archaeology of multiple temples, public spaces, arenas for spectacle and display, notional boundaries which include, exclude and mark transition, the tensely ideological nature of representations of power with associations with fortune and divinity, make it clear, I think, that power is part of a reciprocal system of responsibility and accountability. Reciprocal. King and community in reciprocity with each other. My intuition is that this is how the Romans always thought and argued about power. And that, basically, is the what it is that happened. Not the what happened, which we can't get at. Was Servius Tullius born because a disembodied phallus made love with a slave girl? Or did he create 6 centuries and classes of the army? And did he last for 25 years and get run over by his daughter-in-law? These things are really tough. We're never going to get at that. But we can get at the social imaginary on which they are pulling. And that's why I said to you that I think we need to make the world of the 6th century much weirder, much stranger and much richer than Livy does. And if I'm right that the kings are brilliant lightning conductors for this conversation, that should be something we can keep on seeing. And so next week, what I'm going to do is try to prove that point, that this denseness of association and their importance in the social imaginary is very strong, by taking a very long-term look at the development of Roman kings, Roman views about kings, through a case study of Numa Pompilius. Oh, sorry, there we are. We'll be meeting next week as we go from the 4th century BC into the Byzantine period. We are going to be meeting nymphs, hydromancers, and Christian saints. We're going to witness a king defeat a god in verbal battle. We will read together the most damning critique of Roman imperialism ever penned in antiquity, and I hope we will come to some final views on what Roman kingship meant to the Romans before the concept was taken on into early modernity, the idea of sovereignty and beyond. So I hope I'll see you all next week. Thank you.